Let's go to our regular history segment, and Dr. Grant Morris joins me from Victoria University School of Law. Hi, Grant.
Hi, Jesse. How are you?
Good. Interesting topic for you, the history of political neutrality in New Zealand's public service. What's got you thinking about this?
Yeah, it's just some of the back and forth that's been happening in the media at the moment about the role of senior bureaucrats and, I've got to be careful with that word, bureaucrat. I'm going to use public servant today.
It's a bit pejorative, isn't
it? Yeah, senior public servants and
mandarins.
Yeah, and particularly you would have heard it with State Services Commissioner Peter Hughes, Kate Hawkesby, Ashley Bloomfield, that debate. And I think more interestingly, though, is the way in which we perceive our public service, but also when we've got those 1 o'clock briefings and we've got the Prime Minister and we've got the Director General of Health, that they're playing different roles, and it's important that they're differentiated and that the public understands how they're different. So that's kind of, I suppose, what I'm getting at today.
Okay, go ahead. We've got a little less time than normal, so I guess we start from the approach that we inherited from the UK.
Yeah, so it's really important to note that when we started here in New Zealand, so in terms of the British state, 1840, up until when our Parliament really gets running in the mid-1850s, we've got a governor who's calling the shots for the most part, acting on instructions from London, and he's appointing what we would see as the public servants. And so they're his appointments, and they're technically working for the British Colonial Service. So they're very much political appointments, and when we get our Parliament and we get our responsible ministers, that responsibility of appointment and doing all of those important jobs about who gets to be a public servant, that's taken over by the ministers. So it continues to be political. And it's really the opposite of what we have today, because we have a politically neutral public service, but back then they had a very much a politically biased public service. And, that was, reflective of the time, but it also meant that you didn't necessarily get a system based on merit. And you also got a system, where if your minister was no longer there, the one who had appointed you and protected you, then the next one might come in and there goes your career. So all of those kind of HR roles that we would associate with being in a job and being a public servant, they were controlled by the politicians, and that made it very difficult to today.
And that still happens to some extent to the US, doesn't it? Their political appointments. Probably a topic for another day. That'll change in New Zealand in the early 20th century, though.
Yeah, so the important statute that we need to remember today is Public Service Act 1912. Now, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's been gradual moves towards it where people are getting worried about the system of political patronage and the quality of public servants and the political nature of it. And so the Hunt report, William Hunt's Royal Commission into the Public Service, recommends a merit-based system and political neutrality. And to move that, especially the appointments, because appointments are so important, who gets appointed, how they get appointed, to move that from the ministers to an independent entity, what we now see as the State Services Commission, what they call the Public Service Commission. So all of that really important HR work, that all goes into this apolitical institution, and it has a number of effects. One is you arguably get a better public service because it's done on merit rather than political viewpoints or loyalty. And also it becomes more cohesive, because instead of ministers basically setting up their little kingdoms with people that they like, you get a broader public service where everyone's gone through a similar appointment process and they're there because they're going to do a good job as public servants. So you get the beginning of a proper career progression as well.
And then have there been any major changes since that act in 1912?
So that's the key change, if you like, from being very politicised to being apolitical, but it's continually reviewed. So you get the McCarthy report, Justice Thaddeus McCarthy in 1961, checking in, seeing how is it going, making some changes to the public service, but basically saying, yes, political neutrality is still working well, we're going to continue it, We're going to have a State Service Commission instead of a Public Service Commission, but we're going to keep with that neutrality. And what I wanted to raise, though, is that's continued to this day. We have a politically neutral public service, and that's really, really important. But what has been argued is that the public service can still be captured by an ideology. So not a political party as such, but an ideology. And that's what's argued, some argue happened in 84 through to 93. Where arguably, again, it's contested, Treasury had an undue influence on the government with a neoliberal ideology. And it was able to roll that out, even though public servants aren't elected, it was able to roll that out through its power and influence over the government. And so it wasn't captured politically, it was captured ideologically. And so the question is, can our political neutrality kind of guard against that, assuming we want to guard against that, being captured by a pervasive ideology? So I thought that was an interesting point to raise.
So how do we look at it now in 2021? Fair to say they're politically neutral, but you sort of suggest that might not be the same as ideologically neutral.
Yeah, so the politically neutral, because of the appointments process, it means that you can disconnect it from the ministers, you can disconnect it from the politicians, and so you don't have that appointment by politicians. So that's really important, but it's still, I believe, possible at any given moment in our history for a pervasive ideology to run through the public service and for that to then manifest itself through government. I gave the 1984 example, but there could be others as well. I mean, I think New Zealanders, if we look at Gliding On, for example, the iconic 70s, 80s play and show, I think New Zealanders have a lot of respect for public servants. I think they have a respect for that political neutrality. I think there's possibly a bit of criticism about what's perceived as a cushy job. I don't think it's particularly accurate, but I think that's what perception is and what Gliding On captures. But overall, I think recent surveys at least have shown a high level of confidence in our public service.
Thanks so much, Dr. Grant Morris from Victoria University, our regular history slot.